Hi everyone, and welcome to Know Your Food with Wardee. I'm Wardee, a wife, mom of 3, and the lead teacher and founder of TraditionalCookingSchool.com. I'm also the author of The Complete Idiot's Guide to Fermenting Foods. I'm so glad you're here. This is the podcast devoted to healthy family cooking with traditional methods like sourdough and old-fashioned pickling. These foods are delicious, easy, healthy, and your family will love them. If you haven't already, be sure to grab my free gift for you. It's 5 free traditional cooking videos from inside Traditional Cooking School that will introduce you to my favorite fundamental techniques of traditional cooking. To start watching now, just go to knowyourfoodpodcast.com/watch. And now let's get to today's episode. Hi everyone, welcome to Know Your Food with Wardee podcast. This is episode 166. I'm so glad you're here. I want to give a warm welcome to all our live viewers who are joining me here on Periscope to talk about gardening, and those of you who are coming in later either through iTunes or the show notes. Welcome to all of you. If you're listening to this on your audio, you want to switch to video, you can do that at the show notes, knowyourfoodpodcast.com/166. You can also visit knowyourfoodpodcast.com/166 when this is released as a podcast to get the kind of the print notes of everything I'm sharing here, the system I'm going to share with you today on gardening. So feel free to check that out. So here's the promise of today's podcast. I am sharing how I got the garden in over the course of just 4 days with a total of 7 hours. And I did have some help. And that's kind of the system that I'm going to show you, the 4-day system to get the garden in. Now, your mileage may vary because you may have a smaller garden than me. You may have a larger garden than me. You may have different ways of doing things. You may have different things you're planting. One of our commenters says she does a greenhouse. I didn't do a greenhouse. So over the years, I've just gotten simpler and simpler so that I can enjoy the garden, so it doesn't get beyond me. It fits with our life, and just be kind of purposeful about it. So you all need to balance those things and, figure that out for yourself. So I'm not one to tell you do it exactly like me. This is an example of how I actually have made it work for us and my family. Actually, I shouldn't say I, because this is definitely a family effort. So before I go into the 4 days and the total of the 7 hours, I want to start out with some assumptions here. So we're all on the same page, and then you kind of know the backstory. So our garden area, we have 6 raised beds. I forget now, are they 4 by 8? They're 4 by 8 size, okay? They're not terribly deep. They're this deep, okay? They are all mulched heavily each year. So we mulch in the spring and we mulch in the fall. We use spent straw or hay from the barn, so we repurpose it. What I can remember is we've never had to go out and buy straw or hay for the purpose of the garden, where it's been used for something else and we're reusing it, and we do mulch heavily again in the spring and the fall. We're always making compost. It's my son's job, so we have a bucket next to the sink, and every day or so it's full of scraps and stuff, and he takes those out and he layers it up with paper or greens. And in Oregon in the winter it's moist, so it gets watered by the rain, but we also water it ourselves during the dry season. And the shredded paper is black and white paper. We have a shredder for the business, and we don't run plastics or color through it. We just do black and white, and I shred, because I'm kind of mostly digital, so I shred a lot of things, and that is the paper that goes in the compost. So we're always making this compost. And the kids' job in the spring, and it's usually my husband who's the one who's like really on it, and he's like, okay, it's time, he tells them it's time, and it's the kids' job to move the compost that's been composting in the spring into the garden beds. And so they do that in the spring before planting. Also, when they add the compost to the beds in the spring, or actually prior to it, they're doing some weeding in there. And it's kind of minimal because of the mulching. But weeding still needs to be done. So this is kind of the prep stuff. These 3 things I've talked about, the mulching, the compost, and the weeding. All these prep things are happening regularly through the year, either ongoing or at certain times in the year, to make the garden planting so easy. when it comes time to do that. In fact, it seems to get easier and easier. You may have noticed this if you've got a garden going for a couple years, is if you keep up with the weeding and you do the mulching and the composting, you end up with like less maintenance to do. You get richer soil, the worms are in there, and fewer weeds if you keep up with them and and they don't go to seed. All right, so that's laying the groundwork for the things that are happening year round and kind of the size of our garden. And I'm loving your comments. Keep them coming. I love reading them as I'm speaking. Another thing just in particular about this year is my timing was a little off. Normally, what I do is right after Mother's Day is when I plant. If I plant earlier, it's too cold and things don't do well. So I just wait till Mother's Day, no matter how nice the spring seems and no matter how eager everybody is to get going. It's just like, no, we're going to wait till after Mother's Day because then I know for sure it's going to work. Well, this year I even waited 3 weeks beyond that because we were quite tied up in May with our oldest daughter got married in December, very small wedding. We had her reception. We call it the celebration. We had it in May, at the end of May. So that delayed my putting in the garden because we were quite busy with those preps. So the week after the reception, the weekend after, is when we put in the garden. So now what I'm going to do is share, I have one more kind of precursor thing to say, and this is something I'm refining over the years, is I don't sow a lot of seeds anymore. I used to do a lot of seeds, but I don't really. I do some, and you'll see that coming up. But I focus a lot on plants for a number of reasons. One of them is friends, family, and even quality local organic nurseries are doing incredible things with plants and providing wonderful heirloom organic plants. So supporting them makes me happy, and they're doing a really good job, better job than I would be doing kind of haphazardly making do. So I focus on purchasing mature plants for the garden. I also, another thing that I focus on is, they're fairly mature. They're not starting for seed, so it's sort of like you put them in and they're already, somewhat established. You don't have those weeks for them to get to that point. The other thing is I don't grow everything. I grow the things I really want to grow. I don't feel the burden of having to plant everything. So the things we really want, that's what we plant. I personally love zucchini and squash, but I'm the only person in my family who really does. So, 3 years ago, you would have caught me putting in one zucchini and one summer squash plant. Well, I can't keep up with that. And the rest of the families, they don't hate it, but they don't love it. So it doesn't get eaten. It grows up all over. So I just decided I'm not going to plant it anymore. That's something I can purchase at the farmer's market, or friends are planting it and they're sharing it with us. And I'm not going to give up a bunch of our space in the garden to that. I'm going to instead give up a bunch of space in the garden to something that the whole family loves and that we can keep up with the yield. So again, I focus on plants wherever possible because it supports people. Plus, when they go in the ground, they're kind of ahead of the game, or I'm ahead of the game. And second, I'm choosy about what I plant. I don't plant everything. I plant the things I really want to plant, or I grow the things I really want to grow. All right, so that's laying all the groundwork. And I think it's important to lay all that groundwork because if I'm sharing how I put in a garden in a total of 7 hours over just 4 days, you have to be able to compare it to your needs, wants, desires, size of garden, priorities, and everything like that. We can't just compare apples to oranges, and I don't want anybody to come out feeling like, oh, I failed because I didn't do it in 7 hours. Well, maybe you're doing more, or maybe you have different goals. You know what I mean in that. Anyway, so now I want to go through the step-by-step days of how this happened. And remember, earlier this spring, the kids weeded, mulched, added compost to the beds. So that was all done. So in the comments, Amy's saying, my problem is I want to plant everything. Yeah, well, I just encourage you to, plant everything if you really want to. That's fine. And another Amy is saying that too. All right. Well, so here's day one, and this was the first 2 hours. We did a deep watering of the beds. This was so when we add the plants, it's just all moist and ready for them. It's also So there was a bit of weeding to do, and so the weeds will come out easily. So deep watering of the beds. We weeded in the beds, which there honestly wasn't very much because the kids had done it earlier in the spring, and the mulching keeps the weeds down overall. We planted a bunch of things, not everything, but we did plant. My daughter helped me this day, by the way, so the 2 hours was 2 of us working together. So we put in all the tomatoes, which were a gift. We didn't plant them all, but we received about 20 tomato plants from someone who'd started a bunch of tomato seeds and had way too many. So they gave us 20. So I didn't even have to purchase any tomato plants. So that was a wonderful gift. So we put in all the tomatoes, the peppers. I wanted to do a lot of hot peppers this year, in addition to like the salad peppers. So we did a ton of those, and we did our cucumbers. So we put all those in. And we had, as we were weeding and kind of out there, we noticed that we had tons of volunteer lettuce from last year. So we just left those in because, hi Vicki, because they could be between the tomato plants, we just left them because they were already probably a good 8 inches wide and had a good 10 to 20 leaves on them. And we just figured we will just harvest them very soon. So we just left those be. So it was sort of like having, it was probably about 20 tomato plants lettuces that were complete volunteers that we left alone. And so that was day 1. Watering, a bit of weeding, and planting the tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, as well as leaving the tomatoes alone. That was day 1. Okay, now we're on day 2, and this was about 2 hours as well. So there was more weeding because there was one bed that had like lots of morning glory and lots of thistles. It was the herb bed where I had left several herbs to overwinter. And there was a lot of morning glory and thistles just tangling all that up. So my daughter and I, the day before, we were just like, well, we're tired. We'll save this one for tomorrow. So we did that on day 2. We pruned back some of the plants that had overwintered. So like I mentioned, the herbs. So I had a sage that had gone to seed, tons of flowers, tons of sage leaves, cut that back, which also helped with getting the morning glory out of it because it was quite infested with morning glory. Also, we had a chard that had overwintered and cut that all back. And we planted herbs. And I had purchased herbs from the local farmers co-op, organic herbs. Let's see. So that was about two hours. I also, but it's not really included in the 2 hours because I consider it harvesting, not planting. I took that sage I cut back and I pulled off all the leaves and I laid them out to dry. And they're still drying now. If you want to see a picture of that, that's on my Instagram @TradCookSchool. So that was day 2. More weeding, pruning back the plants that had overwintered, and planting herbs. Day 3 was 2 hours, and this is where I turned to sowing seeds for the few that I do sow. And we just do broadcast style mostly. So lettuces, carrots, radishes, beets, and then the ones that I don't broadcast that I put in holes 3 inches apart are the bush peas and the bush beans. And we also mulched all the beds because it had gotten light from the last time, but except where we sowed seeds, no mulch there. So that was about 2 hours, and that's day 3. So we're at a total of 6 hours now, and finished with day 3, and we have everything in. Everything. Do I do regular or heirloom seeds? I do heirloom almost exclusively. If there's a plant that's not heirloom, I definitely choose organic. What do you use as mulch? Okay, I mentioned this at the top of the hour or the top of the podcast. We just use straw or hay that's spent or used from other purposes in the barn. So my daughter had cleaned up the barn last week or a week ago, and she had several bins and the wheelbarrow full. So we had 4 containers full of mulch ready to go for the garden, and we put it out very quickly. Okay, so day 4, this is the very last day of this getting the garden in this year, and this took 1 hour, which is to weed around the beds. I've mentioned weeding in the beds. Well, our beds are on just a pasture area, grassy area. It's actually mostly weeds. And my husband goes in there and weed whacks, but he can't get right next to the beds. So we have to just keep up the weeds that grow right on the edges of the beds. And so that took an hour, and that's all cleaned up now. And that's it. seemed like I can't believe it because I was so busy with our daughter's reception thinking, oh no, it's 3 weeks late. I haven't got the garden in. I don't have time now. It's getting so hot. But it seriously didn't take very long. And I know in part that's because I'm choosy about what we put in, and I'm focusing on plants rather than seeds as much as I can. But it's also because of the mulching and the compost and the maintenance and the systems that we have going year round. So when it comes time to plant the garden, it's not such a big ordeal because you don't have to start from scratch with a big old mess. You have you kind of have beds nearly ready to get things in. And I want to say that if I was left to my own devices, this would not be the case. I really benefit from my husband keeping up with the kids and the different outside chores. And I'm so thankful because, it's my job to do, it's my job. There's a division of labor in all homes. And so I oversee the planting and the harvesting, and my son and daughter work closely with me on watering and planting and all that. But that's kind of my domain, is to get it in. And his domain is to keep it kept up in between. And so he makes sure that the compost is going. He makes sure that the mulching happens. He makes sure the compost is worked in. He makes sure the weeding and the weed whacking. And so I just can't say enough about how thankful I am that I benefit from that. And that's why I can't take credit. I just can't take credit for being easy because it's a family effort. So I don't know what your situation is, but if you are overwhelmed with having to start from scratch every year and having to put in a garden, but also having to clean up tons of weeds and work in the composter, all that, think about if someone in your family can be responsible for those things, and you can divide the labor up so that when it comes time to plant the garden, it's not such hard work. And sometimes when things are such hard work, they don't end up happening because we don't have bandwidth or energy to do huge tasks. But if it was easier, we would get it done. So that's my encouragement, is just to think about, maybe not right now, but for next year. Like, what can you do this fall when you're tearing everything up and composting? Can you mulch and clean things up so that the winter is easy on the beds? And then in the spring, when it's starting to green up and all that, can you husband, kids, prep the beds earlier, so then when you're headed out to plant, it's just an easier thing. And that's really all I have to say for today's podcast. To be honest, I was like, what am I going to talk about today? Life has been so full and busy lately, and I didn't have a guest lined up, and I was like, what's been going on lately that I could talk about? And then I was like, oh, the garden was really easy this year. So I'm going to talk about how that was such a highlight of my June so far. Well, I want to thank you all for being with me. It's been such a pleasure. I've seen lots of hearts flowing and lots of comments and thumbs up, and thank you so much, Vicki and Amy and everybody else who's here, for your constant support and the blessing you are to me. I'll just wrap up by reminding everybody that the show notes when this podcast is released are at knowyourfoodpodcast.com/166. It'll be kind of a summary of everything I've shared. And of course, the audio version and the video version will be there too. Thank you so much. Thank you, Leanne. Good to see you here. Well, God bless you all, and goodbye. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you'll come back again soon. Here's what you can do next. You can visit the show notes for this episode to get links and more resources about today's topic. Just visit knowyourfoodpodcast.com/ and then without a space, type in the number of today's episode. You can stop by knowyourfoodpodcast.com/watch to get 5 free traditional cooking videos from me. It's a gift. And finally, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, the podcast app, or Stitcher. If you're on a mobile device, just search for Know Your Food with Wardee right in the app. If you're on a desktop or laptop, just go to knowyourfoodpodcast.com/iTunes right in your browser. And while you're there, please leave a rating or review. I love to get your comments, and your feedback makes it much more likely that others who are interested in traditional cooking will find my podcast too. Thanks so much. God bless you, and I'll see you again soon.